everyone. Welcome to the health tip this week. So this week we're going to have part one of an interview that was done with the author of Can You Catch a Cold? So these interviews, I basically took an hour and something interview and divided it up into three smaller segments so you can digest it a little easier. In the first segment, we'll get into why the author chose to do this book and the research he did on it and some background, and I think it's all very interesting. And it's probably going to challenge a lot of your viewpoints and what you think about why we get sick and how we pass things to each other and if that actually happens. And so it's going to be some pretty cool information. So this is part one of the interview with the writer of the book, Can You Catch a Cold? Let's have a
The
look.
overwhelming majority of people approach reality as if it's a well-established, irrefutable fact that disease is spread via the fluids of a sick person. From the time that we're a little kid, for virtually anyone, we're told to stay away from others when they're sick. We're told that when someone is sneezing and coughing, having diarrhea, throwing up, et cetera, that they could pass something to us and we might get sick as well. But has this idea that fluids from a sick person cause disease or illness in a healthy person been established empirically? Is it actually true? Are there other explanations for the phenomenon of two or more people getting sick in the same space with similar symptoms? Of course, if you've been listening to this podcast for a while, you already know where I stand on this issue. And you know that I've recorded a number of episodes related to terrain-based health and the pseudoscience of the failed germ hypothesis. For those of you who are new, this may sound absolutely crazy that I'm even questioning this, or my guest, Daniel Roytas, has written a book on it. But as you'll find out during this episode, there's a lot more to this topic than what we've been told. And I think that this is one of my all-time favorite episodes. Daniel Roytas trained as a naturopath, nutritionist, physical therapist, and psychotherapist. He was a lecturer and senior lecturer of nutritional medicine at various colleges and universities around Australia for over a decade. After realizing the issues with the natural medicine industry, Daniel resigned in 2022 to focus on discovering the truth about health and wellness and educating people about what he had found on his platform, Humanly. And you can find more about his platform and Daniel's book in the show notes. He recently released a book, Can You Catch a Cold? Untold History and Human Experiments, which challenges the idea that colds and flus can be caught. So in this episode, we focus on the details of his book, and we also discuss common questions that arise within the holistic health and health freedom community with respect to the germ versus terrain discussion. What he's doing is incredible. This book, I've not read it yet, but just based on what we discussed during this episode, I am so excited to read this book. I know doctors Mark and Sam Bailey have been raving about it, and I have so much respect for what they have to say. He's truly a wealth of knowledge on this topic, and the research he has done is really, really paradigm shifting and incredible, and just lends more credence to what we're coming to understand, that the entirety of the germ paradigm is completely unproven and pseudoscientific. And I'd like to ask that if you're watching or listening to this episode and you have the means to do so, please order a few copies of Daniel's book so that you can help spread this important information across the earth, infecting the masses with the true knowledge of health and disease. Enjoy. Daniel, man, I have been looking forward to this conversation for a long time. I have been watching you from afar, been a huge fan of your work. What were you doing before all of this? And how did you come to, discover all of this information?
I was a lecturer at a university for 10 years and towed the line with all the ideas and concepts that were taught about health and the human body, but from a so-called natural medicine perspective. But looking back on that now, it's actually a green pharmacy perspective.
Right.
Because I think that the field of natural medicine has been infiltrated and it's being systematically dismantled. So yeah, that's what I was doing. I got exposed to the terrain theory back in my undergraduate degree. I got exposed to this idea. My immunologist lecturer was talking about the fact that germs don't cause disease. And I thought, what nonsense. Germ theory has been proven. And I had basically operated from a germ terrain duality for most of my professional career until 2020. Like you said, you heard Tom and Andy talking about this. And it immediately resonated with me. I knew it was the truth. But being in the position that I was in as a lecturer and giving lots of public presentations and talks, I knew that if I was going to talk about this as an educator, I better do my due diligence and make sure that what they're saying was correct. So I started looking for experiments to prove contagion. And this is where the book really started, was back in 2020. I just started accumulating all these hundreds of experiments until Roman Bystrianic, the author of Dissolving Illusions, said, hey man, you've got like this massive repository of information. You should really write a book on this. And that's where the journey started for me. I go in various different directions with the book, but the prevailing underlying theme addresses this idea that you can get sick from being in close proximity to another person who's sick or being exposed to their bodily fluids. So they've coughed or sneezed on something, and then you've not come in contact with them, but come in contact with the fluids, and you pick up something from the fluid and make yourself sick. This is the prevailing idea that's in the forefront of everyone's minds for the last 4 years and our lives, really, our whole lives.
Yeah.
We're born with this idea that you can catch something from someone else. If they're sneezing or coughing, you better stay away because you don't want to catch their flu. And we grew up with this idea and we believe it wholeheartedly. A lot of focus has been put on the isolation of viruses. That we must prove that these things exist to demonstrate that they actually do what we're told, that they cause disease. And I do focus on this on the book, but I really wanted to know, are there evidence, empirical evidence, observable, demonstrable, repeatable evidence that shows that when people do come in contact with sick people, they get sick? And those studies do exist. They have been done. And time again, they've essentially failed. I won't say that they failed in every single instance because they didn't. And in those situations where they didn't fail and people did get sick, I couldn't find evidence of a germ being the cause, even though I went into this with an open mind and was willing to entertain any and all ideas. I couldn't find evidence for that. So what I had to do was go and look for other evidence that might explain why people in those situations got sick. And I talk about what those reasons are in the book. And they're not my beliefs. They're not my speculations. Like all of the things that I mentioned in the book are referenced in the medical literature. They have been shown to cause flu-like illnesses. And once we understand that, it brings into question this idea of viruses being the cause. Because if there are multiple other reasons why people get sick above and beyond viruses, then you can't blame everything on a virus.
Right.
And to blame everything on a virus, you must disprove all the other possible causative factors before you then jump to this viral causation theory. You can't simply just jump to viruses and say, yeah, it's definitely a virus, when there's half a dozen other known things to cause exactly the same disease presentations.
Right. I mean, that's what we saw at the beginning of, quote, COVID, is that a patient presented himself in Wuhan, China, and they already had the preconceived idea, given that he had tested, quote, negative for other viral illnesses, that, oh, this still must be a viral illness. So let's send off his sputum sample to, be tested for maybe a new virus. And this presupposition has dire consequences. And again, that's, assuming that there wasn't other intentions and this was all just by happenstance because of these unfortunate preconceived ideas. But the point being that there are major, major, major consequences for this line of thinking.
Yeah, there are. And most people don't know there are other explanations. They are of a one-track mind, of this unwavering belief that it's all down to a virus, where nothing could be further from the truth. There's so many other reasons why people get sick. Even when people get exposed to bodily fluids, there are other things in bodily fluids that have been demonstrated to cause illness that are not viral. In the early 1900s, they started doing some of the first human experiments on influenza, where they took bodily fluids from sick people and they started to inoculate it or squirt it into the eyes, nose, throat of healthy people. And in these experiments, people got sick. They got symptoms of a cold and flu. And as you said, they presupposed that it was a virus. So they made this leap of logic that there's a virus in this person. It's in their respiratory system. When we take the mucus out and put it into a healthy person and they get symptoms, it's because we transmitted a virus. And that's the conclusion that they arrived at. But they didn't know that there are other things like inflammatory chemicals inside mucus. So when you get a cold and flu, the thing that causes those symptoms isn't the virus. It's actually your body. So your body releases these inflammatory chemicals to cause coughing and sneezing and mucus production as a means of expelling whatever irritant you've inhaled or been exposed to. So this is a similar type of thing with an allergy. Yeah, you get exposed to a pollen, the body releases and has an inflammatory response, and you get the allergic response. So same kind of thing with a cold or flu. The body releases these inflammatory mediators and you get the symptoms. Unlike viruses, scientists have taken they say they've isolated these inflammatory chemicals. Maybe they have, maybe they haven't. I don't know. They say they have in these experiments, and they've exposed people to pure samples of, say, bradykinin or histamine or prostaglandin, various types of prostaglandins. And it reliably causes symptoms of a cold or flu. So we're talking sneezing, coughing, fever, headache, sore throat, right? Exactly the same kind of symptom presentation as the flu. And when you get sick, the level of these inflammatory mediators increases 30 times in your mucus. So if you're taking mucus from someone who's sick, a healthy person, you have to prove that it's not the increased levels of those inflammatory mediators in the mucus that are causing the illness. If you're going to say it's a virus, you have to disprove that potential confounding variable. And there's also other things in there as well that you'd have to demonstrate that aren't causing the symptoms, but this is just one example. And they didn't know that these things existed in the early 1900s. So they just jumped to this conclusion that it's a virus. But if they knew that the mucus was full of these inflammatory mediators that just conveniently happened to cause the same symptoms as a cold and flu, maybe they wouldn't have been so eager to jump to these erroneous conclusions.
But even so, with respect to these examples where there is a substance inside the fluids of a sick person that has the potential to cause illness in another person, this is still a very, relatively small number of cases in which they have successfully demonstrated that there is something inside the fluids of a sick person that causes symptoms to arise if exposed to another person. Correct?
I don't think this happens naturally.
Right.
I don't think that you can sneeze on someone and their inflammatory chemicals go inside you and causes an illness. That's sort of not what I'm saying.
These are examples of where you're taking something, the fluids of a sick person, and like stuffing it halfway down their throat or scratching, essentially their esophagus or something like this, trying to elicit symptoms because, again, they already have this presupposition.
Yeah, these experiments don't reflect the natural mode of transmission.
Right.
So they are putting people in close proximity in some of these experiments and getting them to cough and sneeze on each other, but nothing happens.
Right.
It's only when they take massive amounts of this snot, mix it with saline, and put it into their respiratory tract that they get these symptoms. And like, there's so many doctors who have been asking these questions of, how do you know it's not nocebo? How do you know it's not the act of inoculating something into a person's respiratory tract? How do you know it's not an inflammatory response or a chemical response or a physical irritation. So doctors are asking these questions today, but actually doctors were asking these same questions about these experiments when they were being done. So they were publishing their critiques in the medical literature at the time going, you guys can't claim it's a virus because you got this and this and this and this. You got to disprove all those things first. I'm not saying that being like someone coughing on you is going to make you sick from being exposed to an inflammatory mediator. It's more that these things probably do exist in the snot. And by doing that unnatural exposure method may be one reason why people develop symptoms. Of course, there's other things as well, like the power of belief. Oh, I'm getting someone else's snot squeezed up my nose. That could potentially induce a placebo or a nocebo-induced illness. There's all kinds of different reasons why. But yeah, these were the sort of the early experiments. And then they became more elaborate over time where they did these sort of person-to-person experiments where they put healthy people in contact with sick people. And they didn't have much luck there either.
Yeah, and we're talking a large number of experiments, correct? How many have you documented?
About 204 experiments in total. 70 papers that I found over the last 100 years. And within those 70 papers, there's 204 experiments that have been documented. The majority of those failed. So one of the major findings that we report in the book is that the modal contagion outcome or number, so when we're talking about the mode, we're talking about the most frequently occurring result, is none. Zero contagion. So what that means is if you were to conduct an experiment where you put sick people in a room with healthy people, the most likely outcome that you will get is that no one gets sick. So the experiments that did show people getting sick was a very small number of experiments, and those experiments weren't controlled. I think there was out of all these experiments, I think it was some ridiculously low number, maybe 17 or 20 people out of the thousands and thousands and thousands of people that have been exposed in these ways in various experiments got sick with a cold or flu. That's pretty shaky ground to base a claim that transmission between healthy people and sick people occurs. Over 100 years, hundreds of experiments, and 17 people got sick. And even then they weren't controlled. So you can't rule out things like nocebo or the
Can you explain for the audience
using
the importance of controls and what you're getting at here? Because we're talking, there were no double-blind randomized controlled trials where a subset of the group was receiving something they thought was fluids from a sick person, but were not fluids from a sick person, or were being exposed to people who were not sick.
This is another finding of the book, is that the total number of randomized placebo-controlled trials demonstrating human-to-human transmission is zero. Zero. These experiments do not exist. They might. I haven't found them.
You've been looking pretty hard.
I've been looking hard. You've been looking hard.
Right.
Dozens of us have been looking hard.
Right.
Someone that I know who helped me edit this book and critiqued my work is a virologist and microbiologist. He's been looking at this since 2014. He can't find any either. So there are many of us who can't find these experiments, and you would think that for such a generally accepted phenomena that this information should be readily available. Yeah, you said about controls and why they're important. You need a control to ensure that the methods and the procedures that you're employing in your experiment aren't confounding your results, which means that you're not basically creating the results you're looking for, that there's some flaw in your methodology that's contributing to the results that you're getting. So when you control, you can actually say, okay, it's this step in my scientific methodology that's actually causing my results. Right. It's confounding the things that I'm observing. And they don't do that in these studies. Sometimes they use placebo, like saline, but that's what we call negative control. It's not a positive control, which would be bodily fluids from a sick person that contain everything, including inflammatory chemicals, but not a virus. So I was searching high and low to try and find experiments where they got people with allergies and they took mucus from them and exposed it to healthy people and see what happens. But
even then, what's difficult
exist,
about that is it's still begging the question of virus with respect to virology, right? Because these things have never been demonstrated to exist inside the fluids of a sick person in the first place. So even if we were to make concessions in that example, we'd still have to beg the question and cater to them that, okay, we'll make concessions and say that agree with you and say that you've actually demonstrated that there's a virus based on some inferential data or some test that you used before, which is again based in circular reasoning. If they're going to conduct a PCR test on someone to confirm that they have a quote viral like illness before they are then put into these experiments.
Well, yeah, you're right. You would have to prove first the existence of the thing you're claiming is the cause, which hasn't been done to my understanding. It may have been. Again, I don't want to make any positive claims. I'm just presenting the information in the book in such a way that people can read it and make up their own mind. Because I might be wrong. That paper might exist and I might have missed it. But here's the thing. The claim is that when you're in close proximity to a sick person, you get sick. They've tried that and they haven't been able to demonstrate that conclusively. Now, there have been instances where people have gotten sick, where they've been in contact with a sick person. However, they haven't accounted for the nocebo effect, which is the power of belief that essentially when we're born, from the day we can walk, we're told, if you're close to someone who's sick, you will catch their illness. So you're told by people in positions of authority, like your parents, doctors, teachers, the government, that this happens. And one day, inevitably, you're in contact with someone who's sick and then you get sick, and it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. It confirms your belief that this is true. And you go through the rest of your life believing this. So when you go into an experimental setting and you're put in contact with sick people and you get sick, you have to control for that to demonstrate that the power of belief or nocebo wasn't the underlying cause. And in the majority of these experiments where this did happen, this effect did not occur above and beyond the rates of inoculating people with saline. So between about 10 to 30% of the time, people inoculated with saline who didn't know what they were getting exposed to, if it was mucus or saline or whatever, 10 to 30% of people got sick. And those, the rates of people falling ill when put in contact with sick people never exceeded those numbers. So you can't, even if you do see this effect occurring, you can't say it's anything else but the nocebo effect until you prove otherwise or you control for it. So one way that you could do this is by putting healthy people in a room with sick people, telling them that the other group is sick, and then seeing what happens. Or you could do other experiments where you get people to come to like the Center for Optimal Health and Wellness, and you physically take snot from sick people and say, we're going to inoculate you with a health promoting substance that actually improves the function of your respiratory tract, and then proceed to inoculate them with the so-called infected fluids and see if it makes them sick. Mm-hmm. They've never done these so-called control experiments. And in fact, they've done experiments to the contrary, where they've had people in clinical settings. They've said to them, hey, look, we're going to expose you to some fluids of a sick person. They give them saline, they get sick. They believe that they've been exposed to the fluids, They get a cold or flu, and the next day they come in to the room and say, tricked you, we got you. We didn't give you snot, infected snot, we gave you saline. And the person gets better within an hour. So they manifested those symptoms with their mind. So that alone detracts from any of the small number of positive results that are observed in these experiments. And sorry, I don't mean to go on, Alec. I'll give you
no. This
the
is
fallback
great,
minute.
man. I mean, you're the guy who wrote the book, so I love it. I'm just sitting here, letting my wheels spin in my head on the directions I want to take this.